Wagwan, everybody. Welcome to the Dis Affamie History podcast, where we'll be speaking about history and as well family history and how history relates in terms of Caribbean people for the present as well as in the past, and how in the past what that does and brings forth for what we are going through at present and what we can learn from our history, from our family, and take that moving forward. So I do hope you enjoy the podcast. And if you like it, please ensure to subscribe, like, and review. Thank you.
In this episode, Wendy Aris will be joined with guest Elisa Romulo Borges, an adjunct instructor of Asian Studies at Florida International University. We will be discussing the article, The Japanese Okinawan Descendants in Cuba. Transculturation, festivals, and pop culture. So let's have a listen.
Much, Professor Borges, for coming on to the podcast and to talk about Japanese Okinawan descendants in Cuba. And again, these are narratives are not really told or really spoken a lot about, and I'm glad to have you on to further discuss this topic and further explore it. So before we start, can I just have you just introduce yourself briefly to the audience?
Hi, Wendy. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to talk about what I love. My name is Elisa Romulo Borges. I am of Asian descent, Cuban of Asian descent, and I'll go into that whenever we address the questions. I work for Florida International University, where I teach Intro to East Asia course. I also work for the College of Business here at the university. My area of expertise merges Latin America and the Caribbean as well as Asia. So I have master's degrees for within the Latin American Caribbean history field as well as East Asia. And then for the doctorate, I specialize in sociology and anthropology, specifically drawing connections between Latin America and the Caribbean and East Asia, particularly Cuba. Initially the Chinese Cubans, and now the Japanese and Okinawan descendants who lived in Cuba.
Perfect. No, thank you so much for that, Elisa. And, I guess the thing is of course, I know you kind of mentioned it in your introduction, but again, what is your why to further explore this topic through this lens, right?
So I have found, first of all, it was my own experience as an Asian descent, not particularly East Asian, but as an Asian descent. I really wasn't aware of my own identity until much later, when I started questioning, where did my last name come from? What was my family about? Why didn't I know anything beyond my grandfather, right? And then I realized that besides the Chinese Cubans, which is what we know the most, we don't know much about other Asian minorities in general who have partaken in the creation and formation of the Cuban identity, right? We know much of the Chinese, and that was even after post 1959, the most obvious migration in numbers, right, were the Chinese, but they were incorporated into the Cuban identity discourse. Unfortunately, other Asian minorities have been actually erased, right, from this narrative, and it's not on purpose. It's simply the tendency to put everyone together under the same umbrella, right? If you have certain characteristics, phenotypical characteristics, people automatically assume in Cuba that you are Chinese, right? And that's the tendency. And in doing so, they're removing the agency, not on purpose though, from these other Asian minorities that have partaken in the creation of the Cuban identity and continue to kind of push forth their traditions and their own characteristics within the Cuban identity discourse.
Yes, no, absolutely. I get what you're saying in terms of melting people into one particular category and not really dissecting and looking at it the way that it should be looked at. And so what would you say, what were some of the main factors that led to Japanese migration to Cuba?
So the main thing that allowed these individuals, so actually prompted these individuals to leave Japan and Okinawa into the island were economic opportunities. The main idea behind migration, was not necessarily to stay, but to return. So Cuba served two purposes. Number one, allow them economic opportunity for them to grow following the early Chinese migratory waves during the 1910s, 1920s, with the boom of the sugar industry. It presented a great economic opportunity for these individuals. So that was number one. Cuba also served as a backdoor to the US, right? So a lot of them had in mind crossing over to the US. So after 1899 and the restriction in Asian migration imposed in the US, Cuba actually served as that backdoor. So it was an opportunity. Whether it worked for everybody, which it didn't, right, was another thing. But it did present that opportunity for a lot of the Japanese and Okinawan migrants. The last thing that I would like to mention, it was that the wars, right? The wars in Asia. You have the Sino-Japanese War. You have the Russia-Japanese War in the wars in the early 1900s, which also prompted migration out of Japan into other territories of Latin America and the Caribbean. So those were pretty much the main pull factors into Cuba for the Japanese. And just to give you some dates, Sino-Japanese War was 1894. The restriction in migration law in the U.S. for Asian countries was 1899, and then you have the Russo-Japanese War, 1904 to 1905. So it's within that period of time, and then you have the booming sugar industry in the early 1900s, 1910s, and 1920s. So it was kind of like a perfect concussion for them to come into the Caribbean.
Yeah, so those particular waves, I think, in terms that they came into within immigration, and I guess further to that, what were some of the primary occupations or industries that Japanese immigrants worked upon upon their arrival?
For the vast majority of them, actually, and I will elaborate a little bit more later with a question that you have, was agriculture. So they thrive in agriculture and gardening industry. So they mainly, you will find the most concentration of Japanese descendants and Japanese first generation at the beginnings in Island of Youth, and then later in the other territories. But because agriculture was mostly formidable in that particular territory, they were mostly concentrated there. But it was definitely agriculture and gardening for them.
Yeah. And I guess how would with Japanese culture practices and traditions, how have that been preserved within the Cuban Japanese community?
So in the Island of Youth, right, they used to celebrate pre-COVID the Obon Festival. The Obon Festival is kind of like a festival that's done to honor the ancestors and so on. So they used to partake in the celebration of Obon and other festivals in Island of Youth. So all of the Japanese community will gather there, right? So it wasn't only the Japanese or Japanese descendants, I should say, at this point, right? There is no first generations left, unfortunately, only third and fourth generation and some second generations, right? So they will gather in Island of Youth and they will celebrate Obon and other festivals. They are a very closed community. So that has allowed for them to keep really good record. Those who know who are of Japanese descent, because you have chances or instances during which the individual does not know that they are of Japanese descent. There's a famous Japanese photographer who was mislabeled Chino Lopez, right? Chino Lopez without the Z, right? And for the most part, he took, if you Google him, you'll see his photographs from Lezama Lima, who was one of the writers, famous Cuban writers, even El Che. So important political figures during his time. And for the most part, because of the name that people used to describe him, right, Chino Lopez, it was thought, anyone who would read it was thought that he was of Chinese descent, but in reality, he was of Japanese descent, right? So in his case, he wouldn't have that network of support that other Japanese descendants have because he didn't know, right? He wasn't claimed by his father, so who was the Japanese, right, person in the relationship. So he didn't know he was part Japanese. But for those who know that are of Japanese descent, there is a very close community, very close network of support. So they keep good track and good record of who they are, their family ties, and how they relate to Japan. And within that network, they make sure that they celebrate the festivals, so they try to keep the tradition alive. Unfortunately, language is one of those things that has been lost. It's very difficult, especially in Cuba, right? Even here, it's very difficult after the second, third generation for language to survive. And there have been programs, and this is all pre-COVID, I should mention again, sponsored by the government of Japan and Okinawa, respectively, right, to promote culture and within culture, of course, language.
Yes.
And third generations have learned a little bit of Japanese, but we can't generalize and say that language is something that has been preserved and continue to be used in their daily meetings. They also have it within the cemetery of Colón, which is a very particular cemetery in Havana, one of the biggest ones. They have their own section only for Japanese and Japanese descendants. And within that section, only Japanese people can be buried, people of Japanese descent. If you are of a Cuban who marry into the Japanese family, then you will be close by, but not in that particular section. So they're very prideful as to their ancestry. They make sure that as much as possible, right, within the economic limitations, that their traditions are kept. And by traditions, I mean the way they cook rice, right? I met this Okinawan second generation couple who had their granddaughters with them. And I asked them a similar question, right? How do you guys keep tradition? How do you teach your grandkids what it means to be Okinawan? And within the Okinawan umbrella, Japanese, right? And she said, well, we have this rice here, this type of rice that it's round, and we try to make it as similar as possible to how my mom used to make it in Japan. So those are the little things that they try to do on a daily basis to kind of keep their culture alive and their traditions.
Yeah, and I can imagine it must be a challenge as well to be able to do that, right? So, um, can you discuss, I guess, some of the any notable Japanese cultural contributions to the broader Cuban society?
So one of the main emphasis of my research for sociology and anthropology, right, was kind of to expand Fernando Ortiz's, who was a Cuban anthropologist and historian, and his theory of transculturation. With transculturation, what he meant was that the Cubans were a complex mix, and we had to understand that that mix was conformed of African, Spaniard, and indigenous to a lesser degree, and this was something that he added later, um, Asian contributions. So within that Asian contribution, of course, he mainly meant the Chinese. And later on, the Japanese were brought in, but not necessarily as strongly, academically speaking, as the Chinese, right? There's a lot written about Chinese Cubans, a lot written about the contributions of the Chinese, right, to Cuban culture, from the cornet, right, to the Chinese lottery, but not a lot has been written about the Japanese. And I think that that has to do with the fact that people confuse them in Cuba, right? Even Cuban historians and in general anthropologists, they don't develop a sense of curiosity as much as with the Chinese, because, well, we used to have one of the biggest Chinatowns in the region, right? But there is not that strong presence when it comes to the Japanese. Their contributions were mainly in the field of gardening and agriculture. That I can tell you, they developed techniques and they brought techniques from Japan that allowed them to succeed in the island. So within that field, they provided a lot, right, to what we had in Cuba up to then. But in terms of culture, it's very difficult to kind of see it beyond the academic world who's aware, okay, this is Chinese descent, this is Japanese descent. This festival is not, it's not Chinese, it's actually Japanese, like Obon, right? Like an outsider passing by and seeing Obon, it wouldn't be able necessarily to differentiate from which Asian culture is coming from. So that's pretty much what I have seen thus far.
And I know that you mentioned it previously in terms of the challenges. So, were there any other main challenges faced by the Japanese community in Cuba?
So there's actually several ones. the main one, and actually the furthest back in history, is when migration stopped. Initially, we spoke how the Japanese were coming or using Cuba for the most part with the idea of returning back
Yes.
to Japan. So there was this terminology or this word called the kasagi or the gasagi, depending on where you read it, right? You can see it in Japanese Brazilian literature, Peruvian Brazilian literature, written differently, but it's the same thing. And it's this idea that the Japanese and Okinawan worker was going to Latin America and the Caribbean with the intention to return. So that was one particular detail or characteristics of the kasagi or the gasagi, right? So the
Mhm.
same for Cuba. That was number one. They never had the intention to stay. Like many workers, unfortunately, a lot of their contracts were not kept,
Yes.
so they were not paid what they were owed. The ticket back home was expensive, so they weren't able to travel back. So they ended up staying in Cuba. Number two, so there was no renewed migration per se when the economic opportunities died down. Nobody wanted to come back. Number two was the fact that without the economic incentive for others to migrate, no renewed contact was done with Japan. The distance is very long.
Mhm.
So there wasn't until recently, historically speaking, that the governments of Japan and Okinawa took an interest on the Japanese descendants in Cuba and actually started sponsoring those programs pre-COVID, right? I don't know the status of that at the moment. So there was no renewal or infusion of culture, right, from Japan back into the island. So eventually they married Cuban families, language was lost. So definitely a big challenge to preserving culture, even though they have that tight community and they try to keep as much as they can, right? Their identity, but unfortunately it's very very difficult. And then recently migration out of the island, so a lot of Cubans are leaving the island due to economic restrictions. So it's within those Cubans, Japanese and Okinawan descendants are leaving too, right? So there is no renewed migration and then people are leaving, so it's very difficult for them to actually preserve post COVID
Mhm.
um, all of those functions that they used to engage in, like the festivals. Like I haven't, after COVID, I don't believe that they have celebrated a bond anymore just because of economic constraints. So it has been a challenge, right, to make these cultural endeavors happen. And with that, the rice, even the example of the rice that we were talking about earlier, how do you get this particular rice in Cuba nowadays to make it in a way that the great grandmother used to do it in Japan, right? It's very, very difficult. You get what is available to you. So those are some of the challenges that are definitely affecting the Japanese and Okinawan descendants on the island, whomever stay.
Yeah, those are, just to maintain what they know and what's been passed down from one generation and make sure it's passed to the next or future generations, that would be definitely a challenge. And I know that you, again, probably you mentioned this before, was how did, with the Japanese community maintain their sense of identity and community cohesion over the years? I know you mentioned a couple of the Oban um, pro, that
The
is done, the
festivals.
festival that's done, sorry, that's done over the years. Is there anything else that is done for, for a sense of identity and community for the Japanese community?
I think that a lot has to do also. Well, number one, I have to congratulate them in
Yeah.
their efforts to keep the Nikkei community alive. Nikkei are those of Japanese descent anywhere in the world. So there's a couple of individuals whom from the outside, Miharu Miyasaka is one of them, from the outside have been able to create this network, or I should say, fortify the network that they already had, right? They had the word of mouth. He's from Japanese descent. We know each other from the same neighborhood. But that over time, obviously, with migrations
Mm.
and even migrations within Cuba, right? Moving from one town to the other to pursue better economic opportunities will make it difficult for the Japanese community to connect. And this Nikkei have done an excellent job. I think she was the one that I know the most because I know she took on a lot. Her father also took a lot of pride in keeping the Japanese community, Japanese and Okinawan community alive. So she kind of took over his responsibilities. and they invigorated their website. So now it's easier for them to keep in touch, right? It's just a matter of sending an email as opposed to having to walk somewhere to figure out if they're there. So even though they are there's a struggle, right, to keep that identity, it's easier to communicate with one another and to provide support. The other thing is their pride in their ancestry. Japanese take a lot of pride. Number one, doing what the Cubans refuse to do. And I say it with a grain of salt because I am Cuban and I am of Asian descent. So I know how we love to just lump everyone under the same umbrella, right? So they love to just make sure that people understand that they're not Chinese, they are Japanese. And the Okinawans, they make sure to tell people we are Okinawans, right? Because Okinawa was colonized by Japan. It's part of Japan today, but they were their own kingdom, the Ryukyu Islands, way before. So they have their own pride. It's so complex, right? And they make sure that people understand, okay, I am from Japan, but I am Okinawan, right? Nationally speaking, I am of Japanese descent, but I am Okinawan, right? And then the Japanese are the same. I'm from Japan, from this particular part of Japan, or my parents or great grandparents were from there. So they take so much pride in where they come from and who they are as a society that even third, fourth generations understand, unlike in my case, understand what it means to be Japanese and the duties, right? The moral values that they believe are correct, they pass it down to the next generation. The importance of family, the importance of keeping a last name, right? Of keeping in touch with the rest of the community as a group. All of that has allowed that even though their migrant group was small compared to the Chinese that we were talking about before, at some point a couple of years ago there was only like 1,300 left, and this is without only, yeah, so not that many Japanese and Okinawans. This is not counting post-COVID migration. So even though they were a small group, that there were no first generations alive, right, they still kept that sense of community. They kept pictures, they kept family trees, and with technology it made it easier for them to communicate and to keep track of who was from what family and where was that person, right? Was it in Cuba, in the United States? So it made it a lot easier for them to keep the traditions alive and also their culture in general.
No, that's great. And then, I guess were there any significant instances of cooperation or conflict between the Japanese community and other groups within Cuba?
So I think it was mostly cooperation. The Japanese, the only one issue that I see is the same that we have discussed thus far, which is in trying to lump everyone within the Asian umbrella, specifically the Chinese, they we as academic, I'm not gonna deviate from field, right? We have deprived other Asian groups from agency because we are too generalizing. Even the small differentiation that I try to do, but sometimes, I just generalize Japanese and Okinawans, right? By not differentiating between Japanese and Okinawans, I'm actually depriving Okinawans of agency. So I think one of the biggest challenges has been that, right? For people to understand, for Cubans to understand that Japanese is different from Chinese and from other Asians, right? That they don't have the same cultural values, they don't have the same characteristics. It's a complete different person, complete different history. And within the Japanese, the Okinawans have their own history and their own community. So that's one of the biggest challenges that I see, right, in terms of academia. How can we move forward, even just making that small differentiation, Japanese and Okinawan, to make sure that this group of people have the agency they deserve? In Cuba, even the literature that's available, autobiographies and novels, you can see that there's one, Lydia Sanchez Fujiwara, short for, they call her Fuji for sure. And she mentions how the Cubans simply just call them the Fujis, right? They omit completely their Cuban ancestors. Like, well, you guys look a certain way phenotypically, so you are the Fujis. The Sanchez does not exist, even though it's the second last name, and the Japanese last name is the third, right? So that's one of the ways in which, yes, it makes them understand, or it makes them take pride in their Japanese and Okinawan ancestry, but at the same time is removing agency and power from what that mix brought to the Cuban identity, right? It's not just Japanese and Okinawan, it's Japanese and Cuban together what form the identity. And in terms of so it creates kind of like this, I call it benevolent Orientalism kind of view, this land lost or this homeland left behind, um, this romantic aura around what it means to be of Asian descent, Japanese descent, Okinawan descent, that it's not necessarily favorable when you're trying to study a population or you're trying to determine what were the contributions of this particular group, like real contributions, right, of this particular group to the Cuban identity, to Cuban society. In terms of cooperation, there has been accounts of Japanese descendants who have fought in the wars of independence. One example dates back prior to 1959. Alberto Takahashi and Goro Enomoto, which were play amazing role as a clandestine role against Batista, right?
Yes.
The dictatorship of Batista. And then there are other instances for post 1959 during which Japanese and Okinawans actually helped the revolutionary effort. So there has been definitely collaboration, just like with the Chinese, right? But the Japanese also had put their grain of salt into, or the grain of rice into what it meant into what it became, the Cuban identity prior and post 1959.
No, I can just imagine you're just saying that one shouldn't override the other. There should be a blend, right? In that. And I guess, what, was the impact of the Cuban Revolution on the Japanese community and their businesses during that time?
So, unlike the Chinese, because they were mainly in the agriculture and gardening sphere,
Yeah.
specifically agriculture, the land reform actually benefited a lot of these Japanese workers, right? They were given land to develop with the agriculture reform brought forth post 1959, and that actually benefited them in terms of economic advancement, very unlike those from other Asian minorities that lost their businesses, right? There was one or two that lost their businesses. Of course, not everyone was a gardener or worked in agriculture, but for the most part, the agriculture land reform actually helped those Japanese who have stayed within that sphere.
So I'm glad to know that that was a very positive experience for them during that time. And I know you mentioned a couple of things, but in terms of the personal narratives that contributed to the understanding of the Japanese experience in Cuba, would you be able to speak to a little bit of this?
Absolutely. So I think that when it comes, and this goes back to what we were discussing before, right? Like, how are they represented in general, in the everyday, in the literature? And I think that part of the revolutionary discourse that made everyone the same actually had a hindering impact on,
Mhm.
we have seen it in other minorities too, right? And other people who compose the Cuba, right? We didn't, by saying that everyone was the same, which we are, right? But the discourse to support the revolution, what created was that people were unable to see other problems. Like, let me give you an example. Let me not be so abstract.
Mhm.
When we talked about the creation of the Cuban identity, the role of Blacks, right? The revolutionary discourse said that there was no racism because everybody was the same. Yes, everybody's the same, but acknowledging that there was racism would have allowed us to look at those instances with a more critical eye. The same for Asians, right? By saying that there was no place for racism within between Cubans and Asians, right? It really erased what was happening, because there is still racism. It exists. It never left. Perhaps less than what we see in other parts of the world, but it's still present, right? People still call whatever Asian, oh, this Chinese person, oh, Chinese, whether in a detrimental way or in an endearing way. Either way, it's first of all, it's not accurate, right? For the most part. And second of all, it really just presents them as challengers of the status quo. That's the way that I see it. By doing that, it's like anything that's different from the norm, whatever that might be, is a challenger of the status quo. So a good example, again, is that novel that I was mentioning before, right? They're not the Sanchez, they're the Fujis. Why not the Sanchez, right?
Exactly.
So what happened there? What happened within the family that it's Cuban for 4 generations, right? Why do they see them as the Fujis? Why remove altogether that characteristic or that aspect of their ancestry that's from the island? So I think that's one of the narratives that we have to be very careful with, right? When generalizing, when trying to determine how was the Cuban identity built, right? What were the discourses that helped us understand the Cuban identity, what it means to be Cuban, what it means to be Asian, what it means to be Black in Cuba? We have to be very critical and very open to what others have to say, because most people just they're closed up, and they're like, well, but I don't think, I think it's just in an endearing way, or I don't think there is racism. And I'm like, but there is, because you still see it today. And by speaking about it, acknowledging, you're actually helping, right, others correct that behavior, something that we are doing or trying to do here, but we're still a little bit behind in Cuba. So by building that discourse of equality, a lot of the experiences are kind of thrown under the rug, right? Nobody speaks about it, because if you speak about it, then you're saying that what the discourse is projecting is not accurate. So you're going against what the revolution is saying, and then that's a problem, right? So I think that sometimes we got to put ourselves in a place of discomfort while having these conversations, so those voices can be heard, and then eventually those behaviors can be corrected, right? Whether it's endearing or detrimental, either way, it's still not okay, right? So I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges that we face when looking at the narratives of creating this identity or preserving this identity. Even people who belong, right, to the Japanese or Okinawan communities, other Cubans don't see them as Cubans, right? So they're Japanese, but in reality they are Cuban. So it's that, how do you reconcile that identity as a Cuban and as a Japanese without having to choose, right? You're not the Sanchez, you're the Fujis, right? So why would you have to do that? So I think that's probably one of the main problems, or kind of clashes with the personal narratives that I see happening in the literature. I mean, you don't have to go to Cuba to know. If you go to Cuba, you definitely know, right? But even in the literature, you can see it reflected in this novel, Lydia Sanchez Fujishiro's, when she says that she takes pride in her ancestry. So you also see that it's kind of interesting. I wouldn't say disconnect, but contrasting ideas, right? You see that they are singled out as the Fujis in a way, in a positive way, I should mention. And at the same time, that there has become this exotic character, adopting this exotic character has become okay within the Japanese Cuban community, but then that leaves out the Cuban part, right? The Cuban element of their own contributions, just Japanese Okinawans, Japanese Cubans, Okinawan Cubans, Chinese Cubans, all of them have something to contribute to the formation of our identity. So picking and choosing wouldn't really do fair justice, right, to what they have done.
No, definitely not. And it's just one of these things, as you said, as long as it's being talked about, it's being discussed, and to further include, them into the discussion, that's what we need in order to move forward in most of this stuff, right? So how would you say, how does the history of the Japanese community in Cuba reflect broader themes in the study of diaspora and of course of migration?
I think that with the current boom in the study of minority roles, right? Research involving minority roles in the formation of culture has continued to be of interest, has continued to be of interest for us scholars. So the history of Japanese and Okinawan Cuban is as fascinating as the history of any minorities, right, that we have come across. So I think that we owe them and we owe ourselves, right? Us that we look at the history of our ancestors, respect by trying to deconstruct those narratives that we were talking about. It instead of generalizing, making an attempt, albeit with a lot of difficulty, right, to deconstruct those generalizing narratives that remove agency from the individuals, right, from the particular minorities, and actually begin to understand and acknowledge and write about what makes them different, right? What makes them, and don't put them as challengers or don't describe them, acknowledging that they are seen or have been seen as challengers of the status quo, but try to make others understand with our research and our writings that it's not the case, right? They have constructed and built within their own specific minorities and identities as minorities. So I think that's probably one of the main, I mean, uh, the main things that we have to keep in mind when we move forward, right? When studying the role of minorities and how much they have done as we move into a more globalized world, right? We become closer and closer together, but it's important to deconstruct everything that was done before to kind of lump everyone within the same umbrella, to begin to understand what each one of them actually provided to the construct of the Cuban identity or the Japanese Cuban, Okinawan Cuban identity, and so on.
Yeah, and everybody brings something different to this story, and that there's always a reason. There's a story behind why, Japanese are in Cuba, and to be able to know that story and to respect it. And I guess talking on that is just that history. How do we, ensure moving forward that, with the Japanese community in Cuba, that this is preserved and this is respected?
I don't know how feasible it will be to continue to sponsor, or not necessarily sponsor, but carry on with the previous cultural traditions that were initially celebrated in Cuba, which is key in order to maintain, right, Japanese and Okinawan presence on the island. Your great grandkids will have to know where they come from and do these traditions, what do they entail, where do they come from, their history. And with the migration outside the island, it has become increasingly difficult post-COVID to actually gather all people of or most people of Japanese and Okinawan descent to carry on the celebrations. Economic constraints are huge as well. It's very difficult to put in the money, right? Unless the government of Japan and Okinawa, respectively, send funds in order to carry on with the celebrations. A lot of the first generations are passed away. Second generations are very, very old. So you have a group of third, fourth generations, and even fifth generations already at this point who um, have not kept their language, with few exceptions. So I believe that the way forward will be if the governments of Japan and Okinawa take a renewed interest in the descendants left in Cuba. For the vast majority of them, what will be left is just to try to keep as much as possible within the household from generation to generation in terms of the community as a whole. And the work of Miharu Miyazaki has been excellent. It does keep people in touch, but mostly people outside of the island, right? Mobility in the island is a little bit difficult. So I think that perhaps outside the island, the Japanese, Cuban, and Okinawan Cuban community will have a better chance to develop or grow some roots, right, elsewhere. On the island, it will depend on the economic effort or economic sponsorship of the governments of Japan and Okinawa altogether, especially after COVID, especially with the current conditions of the Cuban economy, has become increasingly difficult to carry on any program, right? Whether it's cultural or educational, has been extremely difficult. So it will depend on outside help, really. I know that some Japanese Cubans, the Nikkei, have tried to publish some books. I don't know if it has come out just yet, but they were in the words to kind of narrate the history of their parents, right? So maybe publications outside Cuba will also be a way to kind
Mhm.
of keep culture and history alive for future generations and for us scholars, right? We're looking at this group of people from an academic lens.
Definitely. And, Elise, just as we close out this episode of the podcast, what would you say? I mean, what would you provide, I guess, as final thoughts to any of the listeners that are listening or the viewers that are watching um, as to when they're looking at, this type of community in Cuba?
I think that it's important that we start differentiating them from other Asian communities who have partaken or minorities who have partaken in the construct of the Cuban identity. I think we owe them the respect that they deserve by acknowledging their Japanese and Okinawan ancestry. I think scholars and non-scholars alike who are aware of the history and interactions between Japan and Okinawa owe about respect to Okinawans by addressing them accordingly, right? Instead of grouping them together as part of the Japanese, they should also acknowledge that they are Okinawans, right? That's very, very, very important. Again, we go back to that idea of deconstructing everything that has been taught to us, or everything that we think, everything that society has told us this group of people are, and actually start looking at them from a more critical and a lens that's giving them more agency as opposed to removing agency and the voices that they might have. Um, I also think that although there's just a few Japanese Cubans and Okinawan Cubans left compared to other minorities, they're a very strong community. They
Mhm.
keep very strong ties with each other. So even if there are not that many left, I think that those who are left and their families will do a wonderful job in passing down their cultural and historical values, right, to the next generation. So that's not going to be completely lost. It's going to be a little bit watered down, of
Mhm.
course, especially with the loss of language, right? But it's not going to be completely lost. There's that awareness. They have that awareness that they are coming from they are part of a particular minority, Japanese or Okinawans, and their parents or and grandparents are putting a lot of effort making sure that the newer generations understand exactly where they come from and what their ancestors who their ancestors were, right? They do have these particular places within the cemetery and other places of reunion where they can get together, whomever is left, that are not as economically strenuous as perhaps hosting a festival. So that will also help looking at perhaps not renewal but keeping of the culture they already have. And hopefully, again, there's going to be efforts from government of Japan and Okinawan to actually renew some of the culture or some of the festivals or practices that are still conducted to a lesser degree in the island. I do know that for Havana's 500th anniversary, there was a kabuki play that was performed, and I think that although not necessarily targeting the Japanese and Okinawan communities, is also a form of renewal and exposure to a different culture to those Cubans who tend to generalize, right? All Asian minorities belong within the same umbrella. So even smaller instances of cultural infusion will do great, right, when preserving. And then perhaps the most important one is their network,
Mhm.
the way they keep their tight network, right? They keep contact and their pride. Their pride and their ancestry allows them actually to continue to pass it down and continue to look for more information, whether on the island or even abroad.
No, no, this has been great, and thank you for coming on, Elise, to be able to talk about all of this, and to again further add to this narrative that isn't really talked about or really discussed. To know that these Japanese were in not only in the Caribbean but as well in Cuba. So thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Thank you so much, Wendy, for hearing what I had to say, for being passionate about this research. I hope people who listen to this become a little bit more passionate and aware of, these minorities that play such a big role, right, in who we are today,
Mhm.
and are just erased unconsciously sometimes but nonetheless erased, right? So we want to make sure that people know, and this, I think that you're doing an excellent job in gathering these histories, right? That people know where do we come from, right? Who are we, right? Not just the general narratives or discourses that we see that serve a purpose, even in academia, right? Like we ask ourselves the same question over and over again, and you can have hundreds of papers written about identity and construction of identity, but just regular people, right? It's important. People who just won't read an academic paper but will listen to what you have presented in this podcast, it will be much easier for them to understand these differences and these different components of Cuban identity specifically, right? So thank you for the work that you're doing and for, kind of spreading the voice to other audiences beyond the academic world. I'm lucky that you had me.
Hoped you enjoyed this episode, and if you did, please make sure to like, follow, subscribe, and write a review for the episode wherever you listen to your podcast. Thank you.